All right, I'm gonna see if a couple more people join in. Yep, we got one coming in now. Before I get started, let's see, we've got a few coming on in. Gonna open the chat box over here, participants. I can put that over here. Okay, how you guys all doing today? Happy Thursday. Excited to get talking about this topic today. I've got some really good examples of ethical dilemmas, and I know that all of us experience this in shelters, so it'll be kind of a hard thing to talk about, but something that we always should be talking about, I think, because we should always be striving to improve what we're doing and looking for solutions for some of these more challenging situations that come up. So feel free at any point if you want to put any questions or comments in the chat. I will certainly read them as I go through. And if anybody feels like they want to talk about something going on at their particular shelter, I'm happy to let you ask the group. We're all here to support each other. I have a little bit of a script I want to run through today, but obviously I think that it can be hard to talk about these things. So and go through them, obviously. So if at any point somebody wants to, let's see, view the room. If at any point somebody wants to share a story or talk about how they got through something, please feel free. I'm just gonna wait. We have a couple people joining in, so before I get started, I'm gonna wait like one more minute before I kind of launch into my uh whole whole outline for the day. But it would be cool if you guys want to drop in the chat there where you're joining in from. I always love to hear where people are coming in from, and I do see some folks that I recognize, so that's pretty cool. Thanks for coming back. I'm always really excited to see that. I will start. I am in Vermont, and it's starting to get cold here. Finally, the fall seems to be coming in, and we're at the very end of peak leaf season, although we had a big drought here this year, so we didn't really have a very pretty leaf season as we normally do. But yeah, please feel free to drop in, what state you're calling in from. It's really cool to just see the spread of all the folks that want to join. All right, so let's see. The waiting room has kind of Kansas City, nice. Kansas City. I got to spend some time in Kansas City. It was not this summer. It was 2024 and it was awesome there. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for joining in. Oh, Rebecca, the UK. That's awesome. I hope you know Tom Candy. Tom Candy's works with Dogs Trust, and he has Simplifying Shelter Behavior. That's his group, and Tom Candy's amazing. So if you're not in his group, that's another one that's really awesome to join for shelter behavior tips and tricks. So that's awesome. Yeah, everybody just keep Northern Michigan. All right. Oh, we've got one more person. Another area I've never been to Northern Michigan. Is it as cold up there in the wintertime? I'm sure it is. If you're on the little, not the glove part, but what is it, peninsula there? Yes, he did a webinar that he hosted this afternoon, actually. Oh man, come on, Tom. I didn't even know about that. I should have joined. Yeah, I know you guys are like 6 hours ahead over there. So, okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started because today's a long topic, lots of different things to cover. And of course, I'm not gonna be able to get to everything in shelters and some of the ethical dilemmas that come up, but I have a few of the areas I think I often see concentrations of dilemmas popping up and some examples of dilemmas I have been through, and then I also have some solutions and forward-moving strategies for some of those things, or from shelters that I have seen other kind of these difficult decisions and choices that we have to make when we're working in the shelter environment. So, for those of you, might be your first time. My name's Laurie Lawless. If you haven't seen or met me before, I run shelter behavior integrations, and my whole mission with starting this this brand and this company is to help provide some low-cost solutions for shelter staff and employees to learn some stuff online via through this free live sessions, or I do monthly webinar sessions in which I bring experts on to talk about, and I also have some online courses like my play group mentorships, and then also to go to shelters and help build more robust behavior systems that integrate well with the operations of the daily flow of the shelter. It's a big passion of mine uh, to help obviously get dogs adopted and move them through the shelter system in the quickest and most efficient way possible, but also looking at the individual needs of each dog and also the staff that is caring for them and making sure that we're all on the same page in doing so. So today, what I wanted to discuss was some of these difficult ethical dilemmas that come up. Obviously, with sheltering, I'm more, coming from a behavioral side, but I was also an operations manager at one point, not in a shelter, but I've worked in and around operations quite a bit. And so there's no matter what we're doing, it's always a challenge. And having these teams cooperating together is really important. And so we're going to talk about some of the ethical dilemmas that I've seen that I think shelters face quite a bit, and how are we balancing the individual needs of the dogs with kind of the overall population. And then when it comes to certain things, there isn't always a clear answer. And that's what's really challenging about making some of these decisions. However, through the years, I have found that from mistakes that I have that I have personally made and shelters that I've worked with, certain scenarios that have come up, we've been able to put guidelines in for the future. And I'm hoping today what we can do is take away some things that will help you think if your shelter or rescue hasn't experienced these things. We'll either take away from that and think about how your shelter might handle something of that nature, or even making some protocols or guidelines for your staff and your shelter itself. So one of the first things that comes up that I felt was kind of I think the top priority for thinking about ethical decisions is just kind of the different resource allocation and equity across all of the animals that we have in our care. So it is not uncommon for dogs who have behavioral challenges to require a lot more of those resources. And so sometimes that can become tricky when we have dogs across the board who need individualized care as well. It's very common for these dogs who are really having a hard time to consume more staff meeting resources, to consume more of the vet team's resources, to the daily care, volunteers having to do more. And so these are the things that can be really challenging. The other thing with dogs who tend to have more marginal challenging behaviors is that usually actually there's less people who are handling those dogs because we are being careful of protecting the dog in a way that they aren't handled in a way that may help them replicate the behavior we're trying to work on, or um, make sure that there's some management pieces in place to make sure we don't see the behavior themselves kind of devolving or becoming more inherently reinforced through different types of handling. And what that means is we often end up with less volunteers that are handling those dogs unless we have some higher level volunteers, and that puts a lot more weight on our shelter teams. So that resource allocation can be really challenging because these dogs are requiring so much more from the daily operations. So that can be really challenging. And one of the solutions that I try to work on and have worked with and have helped with some shelters is focusing on helping our volunteers who have that extra interest in wanting to handle these animals, getting them the training on how to work on specific behaviors and helping them feel more comfortable. So just as though we would be investing in our staff and teaching, low stress and defensive handling or body language, or we're working with our staff on teaching them maybe some basic training skill sets, that's something we want to help create and evolve into our our volunteer teams so that we can actually help incorporate them into some of our behavior programming. I have found that what this does is it alleviates the staff from having to be the sole ones handling these more challenging dogs. And of course, we have to think a little bit about liability and making sure that we are not putting especially volunteers, but our staff as well, into situations where there are dogs where we may be looking at potential injuries or significant injuries, but putting that time and resources instead of into having our staff do those things is really working with our volunteer coordinators if we have them on building up our volunteer squads, I would say, for those behavior challenging dogs. And if your shelter doesn't have a behavior coordinator, so to speak, there are times where I have seen shelters find that one really dedicated volunteer who maybe comes in multiple times a week and with boundaries and structure in place, allowing them to foster this team. So you can invest into that one um, volunteer who can help build out that program. I've also seen this done with shelters that want to implement structured enrichment plans and making sure that dogs are getting a daily rotation of different items or a variety, and that's a lot for the staff to take on. And so a singular volunteer kind of becomes the spearhead for that. So when we have these dogs that have these marginal issues, and that's largely, that are consuming a lot of the time. Some of the other things we have to think about with balancing the individual kind of welfare with the whole population is that we may start to make some exceptions for certain special case dogs. And this can sometimes cause tension between your teams and also kind of hitting up against what is the overall mission of the shelter itself. So this is an example that I feel I've seen happen. Let's see. Sorry, I just saw a comment in there. Okay, cool. You guys are having a side convo over there about uh the Casey project. That's cool. The Casey Pet project. So for example, this I specifically recall one dog. So in Vermont, wolf hybrids are legal here. And we are one of the few states in which I think that they are legal to have as pets. And we had one come into our shelter that was definitely a pretty high content wolf hybrid, and he was very social with people and other dogs. So there was so much about him that was very good. However, there were very specific circumstances in which it was the predictability of the event occurring, like the first two times that this happened was very not a lot going on in the environment that led to the behavior, but there were two times when he was out with a volunteer where all other times were totally fine, goofy, lovey-dovey dog, but something in the environment changed. And as we know, dogs who come like wolves have a lot more instinctual nature to them as they're more observant of things in the environment. So they often will even pick up a scent or a sound that we can't hear or can identify. And he would turn around and started just repeatedly biting the volunteer and then climbing up. Now, the level or I guess, the injuries themselves were not high. These were level 2 to maybe 3 bites. Obviously when they come in clusters like that, it shoots the intensity of the incident up. None of the injuries broke skin beyond a tooth scrape. However, he did start climbing up, and the volunteer had to back tie him to something the first time. And then it went a few weeks before the second incident occurred, and it occurred again. So we're sitting with a dog who 98.8% of the time is totally fine until this random thing that we haven't been able to identify happens. So what the shelter decided to do was focus on finding an adopter who had experience potentially with wolf hybrids. At this point, the dog had been in the shelter for a couple months. Everybody really loved him because, like I said, 99% of the time he's totally fine. Goofy. Think about like kind of a big lab. It's just like got along with every dog, got along with all the people, fun with kids, etc. And so they did adopt him out to a home who had had a wolf hybrid previously. We covered all the things that had happened. They had a huge yard, rural-ish area, so not a lot of city type activity, etc. And so they had him out. We talked to them about using a long line and a leash and all those things. And one of their neighbors, about a week and a half into his adoption, one of their neighbors' dogs, or I'm sorry, one of their neighbors' chickens from Vermont, got loose and was on the opposite side of their fence. They had a I'm trying to remember if it was chain link, but regardless, he was on the other side of the fence, and the adopter went to pick up the leash to kind of move him away from the fence, and that situation happened again, except he came from a long line, so he came full speed at her and went after her. So the shelter at that time was very conflicted with even within their management team because of this. He could be good 99% of the time until these incidents occur. And then it was like once he was going. And again, no major injuries. It was just very scary and could obviously escalate to a point. And so eventually they were in dispute about behavior euthanasia and him not being safe to adopt. And so this shelter had a policy against sending dogs off-site to sanctuaries and things like that. And in this circumstance, they did go ahead and make that exception for this particular dog. And again, from the behavior side of the shelter was very upset about this because they were going against a policy. They were also, thinking about, you're basically sanctuary is confining a dog to life, and this is a wolf hybrid. It was a wolf hybrid sanctuary wolf dog, and it was in Colorado. So then the shelter on the opposite side felt like this was the right decision. So there was a lot of internal confliction about this decision, and then they decided to go ahead and do fundraising to send him to Colorado. So then he had to be driven out there. It was a whole thing, right? So in one sense, yes, this was good for this dog, and he ended up doing so well at the sanctuary that the owner of the sanctuary ended up adopting him, and apparently he's doing pretty well, based on what they have told us. This is about 3 years ago, so time has passed, and he is not living in one of because he was such a pet dog, so the thought for a lot of us was, well, he's a pet dog and now he's going to go live in a yard with a pack of other wolf hybrids. There's a lot of feelings. So this ethical dilemma of like, what is actually right for the dog and what is actually just feeling good for us, and where does that line draw? And so it turned out that he's actually doing well, and that's wonderful. But following that, because that policy had been slightly breached, a couple more dogs with behavioral challenges came up in which staff was really, or I'm sorry, the volunteers were really infatuated with. And then it became a question about, well, if he got to go to sanctuary, why can't we send these dogs to sanctuaries? And so that led to a culture for a good year of which every time they had to make a behavioral euthanasia decision in the shelter, there was a lot of questioning of management from volunteers. There's questioning of decisions being made from the staff and the leadership team. And so it did create a lot of conflict for about a year following that to kind of reassert their policies about placing at risk or dogs that would be at risk to the community and not sending them to a sanctuary. And that, this specific wolf hybrid had been a specific case. So there was a lot of fallout from that, even though in this particular case, it seems like this placement went really well. But on the back end, we still had to deal with some of these things. So it's hard, right? Like we have to try to sit and make a decision for the dog of like we fundraised, thousands of dollars, not only for him to go to the sanctuary, but also to get him there. And those thousands of dollars could also have been put towards the dogs in the shelter and in our community that certainly need it. So there was a lot of things there. So moving forward, what they decided to do was have a panel with team some volunteer and team input into that to ensure that when they are making special exceptions to clauses, it's very clear. And then that communication is then given as to why this exception was made, and then also that it was a one-time thing. And that way, there was a lot more. They wanted to have, if this event comes up in the future, to have a lot more clarity so that they don't have to have volunteer meetings or meet with people one-on-one to really talk about why this exception was made. So, but this again is just one of those things that we are thinking about. So when we're not thinking about maybe sending a dog to a different organization or transferring out a dog who has special needs, we still have a lot of things that will pop up in the shelter in which we have to have some of these conversations that are really challenging and make decisions that sometimes may seem unfair. So how is it that as a shelter you decide to invest into one dog and then not the other ones? And especially what I'm thinking of, again, going back to dogs who have maybe some behavior concerns or challenges, and then we have a medical issue going on along the side. So I'm thinking of one specific dog that we had that had some minor behavior concerns, nothing too crazy. And then in a play group, she blew out her ACL, I believe, and needed some severe or intense TPLO surgery, which was then going to require long time of rest, relaxation. Now, of course, this was an adolescent dog. This is like all of our worst fears. It's like adolescent dog in the shelter already had some concerns. Right before she blew out her ACL in the play group, she was starting to display some resource guarding, and we had two meetings with potential adopters in which it was going pretty well. And then if she there, I remember one specifically where she made eye contact with somebody and they moved towards her at the same time and she actually exploded towards them. We had to pull her back. And that was a big red flag for me because there was very little warning before it happened and it had been very out of character. So we're thinking like, is it possibly there was pain that was undiagnosed? What are we thinking about as far as investing into this animal and getting this medical care? And we did try to do prior to her surgery an introduction with a woman who was willing to foster her, knew about the resource guarding, knew about some of the stranger danger that had started developing in the shelter. But her and the other dog didn't do super great on this meet and greet. And it just didn't feel like it was going to be safe for her to be in this foster's home, and we were running out of time to make that decision. And so, as somebody who was on the behavior team at the time, I felt that this dog who was already starting to decline pretty rapidly in the shelter, possibly, and this is such the hard thing is, yeah, there could have been pain that was leading to this. However, we are not comfortable putting the dog into this foster home. We didn't have any other foster options. So now we have a dog who is going to be very restricted. She's young. She'll be in her kennel. She's already deteriorating. She's going to go through an intensive surgery. And then we're going to have to sequester her for 6 weeks. And we don't really have an isolation area for her. So she would have to have a crate in a kennel. And so that ethical dilemma of like what is actually best for this animal, we've seen some relatively increasing behavior concerns. One was directed towards a person. It was pretty fast. There was little warning. And even if that was caused by pain, we now have to come up with how are we going to maintain this dog's quality of life? Because she can't go to play group. She can't really go on long walks. She can't. We were in a city at that time. There was no real area to go sniffing. It was just not the best setup for a dog like this. And so, that was really challenging. And the leadership team did decide to move forward with her having this surgery. And she declined so rapidly after the surgery that she became, they had her in an office originally with a crate and she was explosively reacting. So now she's got this leg that she's supposed to be remaining still. She's explosively reacting. So she spent about 2 weeks, and then they moved her into one of the managers at the shelter, ended up taking her into foster, and everything was okay up until I think a thunderstorm happened, and then she kind of lost her cool and charged at, and the person had to like get out of the room and then leave her for about 2 hours before she would calm down. And so ultimately, the decision was made for her to be behaviorally euthanized because even after being in that home for about a week and a half and she was exercise restricted and not in a stressful environment, she displayed this behavior that resulted from a thunderstorm. And it just became the fact that this was not going to be safe for her really to go into any home, and we couldn't expect her to really do better in the shelter, and she was likely going to continue declining. And so then at that point we have a dog that we put through major surgery, was living in a shelter, was created in an office, was moved to a foster home, and it went through all of these decisions and then events that further declined her quality of life. And so this is where we can sometimes get into these challenges, where we're trying our best to save the animals and save them all as much as we can, but we also still have to decide what is worth. We have to try to predict, which is obviously the hard part, like what is going to be like this animal's quality of life if we move forward with doing that. And so I think at that time, personally, for me, I was not. I was on team. Which, like, I would prefer that this dog has a good, happy last few days and we euthanize her because I think her placeability was low before the surgery. And then she unfortunately had to go through all of these things. And that was a decision that was really hard. And it was hard for me, so this is the hard part is when a decision is made that is not one that you would have went with, it's really hard to sit and watch the outcome. And like I said, with that other dog with the wolf hybrid, I was shocked that he did. I wasn't shocked. I guess I should say I was happy that he made so much good progress in that wolf sanctuary and he was with people that understood the breed and eventually was able to acclimate apparently to their home. Again, I haven't heard anything in the last year or so, but hopefully that's still the case. Um, but I still had to sit with that decision and feel uncomfortable with it. And then it turned out it worked well. But in this other situation with the dog we had in the shelter that had to have the TPLO surgery, I watched it all play out the way that in my brain I thought I was going to watch it, and it was really really hard for me to not then feel like I told you so, right? But that's not a healthy mindset to have, and I knew that, but we can't help the feelings that we feel inside. And so the best thing that I could do with that frustration was make sure that we started thinking about quality of life for a dog who already has some marginal behavior challenges, and we're adding in a medical layer. So in the future, we kind of had what we did is we wrote out some guidelines and we worked together, my team, the medical team, and the operations team, about talking about like what are the challenges for each individual dog and mapping those out. So sound sensitive, uh, resources, what are the things that is the dog resource guarding because they're scared, because the environment, we're able to kind of list that out. And then we look at on the medical side, what are the options for this dog? Can we move the dog to foster? Is that safe? Are we able to uh, understand what the duration of this is going to be? What happens if everything goes well and then something happens? Do we need to make another decision point? Like we do a surgery and then the dog blows out its knee again, or the sutures pop out, or the wound gets infected. Like, do we need to reconvene at that point? And so when we're going through these specific case scenarios, we have a little bit of a plan and we're putting that timeline on it or those contingencies within it to kind of help shape what our decisions will look like. Because usually by the time you're halfway through your plan and then something happens where all of a sudden the injury gets infected and now there's like a drain tube involved and now staff has to come 3 times a day to make sure that the injury is healing and all of those little all of those bits and pieces. She's eating her medication now, she refuses to eat. Like, all of those contingencies take resources from the rest of the animals that are in your care, and so then we can get very emotional. So having those guidelines set in place ahead of time of like, well, what happens if what kind of resources will be needed, can be very helpful for that. So yeah, so we need to definitely also consider that if we have a dog who has medical stuff going on, we're also assessing that dog's baseline at the time of intake, right? So I'm thinking of one specific example of a dog who had some massive skin issues, really, really bad skin issues. And the shelter at the time, it's not a shelter I worked at, but was off and on consulting for, moved forward with doing a lot of investment into testing for allergies, figuring out what his skin issues were, trying to resolve what was going on before they did any sort of consideration of behavioral assessments or evaluation of potential triggers for things in his environment. And so this dog specifically was kind of just living his life in the shelter. They were sequestering him from other dogs because he started showing some reactivity. And he had started showing some reactivity towards people. And at the time, they were kind of leaning on that being purely medical. And it wasn't about until I believe 5 months of him being there that somebody said, I really think we need to behavior assess this dog before we put in any more resources into him. And I think if you saw my talk at the Aggression in Dogs conference from 2024, he was one of my case studies because I got there and I worked with him, he was definitely a little aloof. slightly, and now he's been on some skincare medication, so he's feeling a lot better too. Which we can sometimes see when a dog starts feeling better, they may not show some of the behaviors ahead. So again, that baseline is really good to have. We assess them, in and around time of intake, so we have a starting point. Regardless, I was able to work with him quite a bit and he was fine with me. However, I tried to do his dog assessment and it became pretty clear very over 2 to 3 sessions of trying different ways to introduce dogs that he actually showed some pretty scary predatory behavior. There was almost no sociability. He It was not a fear response. I tried a variety of different ways, and it just came to the point where I realized that he was likely going to kill another dog if he got a hold of one. We didn't know a lot about his history. He had come in, I think, from an encampment of some sort, and so we didn't have enough information, but based on what I was seeing and knowing that he was feeling better, some pretty concerning behavior. And so at this point, it's 5 or 6 months into this dog's stay, and a lot of volunteers. The medical staff obviously worked with him a lot, so they were all very attached to him. The staff was very attached to him, and it was really hard because they had already put these resources into the dog, and then eventually, uh, we were like, okay, like we've already put this amount of resources in, right? So you get into that. I hate to refer to this with dogs and sentient beings, but a little bit of like the sunk cost fallacy of like, okay, well, now we're here. So what can we do? So we talk about muzzle training, we talk about what type of home. And then in the meantime, though, his reactivity and stranger danger started increasing towards people as well. So I believe a couple weeks, yeah, it was probably about 6 months in. He was out in a yard with a volunteer he had been with a lot, and then a volunteer who was not a new volunteer, but I think it was her first time kind of interacting with him. And she turned around to grab, I think, a toy off the fence, and he jumped up and lunged at her and grabbed her shoulder in a way that was not an arousal-based behavior, right? And so ultimately the decision was to euthanize. And, again, like these ethical dilemmas come up because they had not really assessed his dog behavior. He was aloof on intake, but he wasn't necessarily showing any of those really critical signs. But we did see some, I don't want to say antisocial behavior, but we didn't see any true social, I want to lean into you, I'm happy with you behaviors based on the notes that I had read, right, of his interactions with staff initially. And there was the presumption of, it was his skin and he wasn't feeling well, which, could obviously be a piece of it, but there's other pieces that likely should have been considered early on before all this was put in. So again, I think when we're thinking about these really, really difficult decisions that we're making, moving forward from that, because now I had gotten involved so late into it. I hadn't consulted with them in probably about 2 years, and then they called me back in for him and a couple other dogs they had at that time. So what we decided to do was similar what I discussed with the previous dog with the TPLO is we put in some guidelines as far as, if we have a dog who has some behavioral concerns and also there's some comorbid type of medical issues going on and it's really unclear which is which, is that we need to kind of establish that baseline from a behavior perspective of like, where are we? We need to look and see like how social is the dog? Um, are they okay with other dogs? Are there responses to other dogs? If let's say they're reactive, is it a fear-based reactivity? Because if it's a fear-based behavior, then that's really helpful for us because we can always work to help dogs feel more comfortable around things they're scared of. It's hard to do in a shelter environment, but it's certainly we can. But if we're getting a lot of like hard staring and forward moving or rather aloof behavior towards people or other dogs, that's where we have to kind of tread carefully as far as our investment of those time and resources that we're putting in on the medical side, because it doesn't, just because a dog has some medical issues doesn't necessarily mean that it changes their overall temperament. It may change their personality a little bit. It may change how they feel. It will definitely change how they're responding to stimuli or like the intensity of their response to stimuli. So something that would make me slightly uncomfortable if I'm feeling at 100%, I might be able to cope with a lot better than if I'm feeling like, I've had the flu for a week and I can't breathe. My response is going to be a lot different. So typically, if when we're working with behavior, you can see some of this, especially through those observations and that baseline at that intake. But it just because a dog isn't feeling great doesn't mean that it changes their temperament, if that makes sense, like who they are as a dog. So again, I think going back to having things outlined can be really helpful. And you know what? I think I'm gonna have to do a part two because this is like three case studies, and I'm like only on the first thing that I wanted to talk about today, which was that resource allocation piece and the equity between animals. From an operational perspective, it's always important to consider whether we want to or not, that if we are going all in or putting all of these resources, and that's for every organization to decide, right? Every single organization is going to be a little different. They have different resources, they have different foster pools, they have a different amount of volunteers, right? So every shelter is going to have a uniqueness that I can't speak to. But whenever we're deciding as an organization to go all in on an animal, especially when it comes to like when we're tipping to severity, whether that's for behavior or medical, resources are going to be real pulled from the other animals and put into that. So, like I said, if we have a dog who requires eye drops 5 times a day, that's going to take time away from the veterinary team, right? Or even sometimes the animal care staff can do that. And so it's not like we're not going to do those things, but we want to also think about for our staff that are working with those animals every day, how much emotional investment they're getting into as well, in addition to their time. And then also, if you're in animal care in any part of sheltering, and I know this from, the amount of stuff that I've done too, and I'm sure all of you feel the same, is if you have extra tasks you need to get done, you are so passionate about the welfare and the being and the care of all the other animals that you are likely going to overwork yourself to make sure you have and are meeting all those dogs' needs in addition to now these additional tasks. And these are the things from a management perspective you have to make sure you're aware of. Um, Yes, three-part series, Abby. I think so. It's like I got 1 out of 4 here because I'll come back to that. I'll tell you guys what's going to be in the next one, I guess, when we get to the end. But from a management perspective, sorry, let me loop back on that, is that if I have a team and I know that I've added these extra things, I need to be aware that they're probably stressing out about the other things that they're supposed to be doing normally on a normal daily basis. And so I may need to either schedule extra volunteers or myself go in and alleviate some of those other tasks they're doing so they can go tend to the one that we're adding that extra, resource pool into. So I will say, like, there are a lot of times in which making the choice to invest in that one particular animal is so absolutely worth it. And so I want you guys not to walk away with like, Laurie said we shouldn't bother. Because like I said with our wolf hybrid friend, like that ended up working out really, really, really well for him. And as far as I know, he's doing super well. They made an exception to a policy. I think that there are times in sheltering where exceptions to policy, like if we're just so brick and mortar about everything and we're so black and white, like sheltering's not black and white like that. So there's a lot of the gray area in between. And so I don't want you guys to walk away with like these sad stories and like everything's terrible. But what I hope you walk away with today is that having an outline when we are considering putting a lot of resources into one or two specific animals that we may or may not do for or need to do for the rest of the population, we come together as a team and have some sort of guidelines for how we're making these decisions, because that is going to be the powerful thing that helps everybody stay together, especially when the initial plan might go off kilter. Because you can come back to your original plan and say, okay, this is what our anticipation was, but things have changed. So let's come together and put a new guideline together for this next phase of whatever this looks like for this particular dog. We need to communicate that transparency. Whether that's the staff or your volunteers, so they're all on the same page with you and they understand the leadership decision-making pieces, because from a animal care point of view, when decisions are made and you're not being told about them, or you're not clear about them, or it seems like it's just all of a sudden out of nowhere and we were doing all of this and all of a sudden we've decided to do this now, that's what can kind of punch holes in that trust in the team framework. And so we also need to make a decision about how we're communicating to our teams about these decisions so that everybody's kind of in one place of understanding. And so, yeah, so I guess I'm gonna have to do like three more parts to this because the other pieces I wanted to talk about was, let's see, length of stay versus emotional suffering. And, talking about do we move dogs out to foster homes? Again, speaking mostly to dogs with behavior challenges. We often have people who are willing to foster, but we often have dogs that need foster, have behavior problems. Unless you're working at some miracle shelter. If you are, let me know in the comments. But most of the time, the dogs that need the foster the most are the ones who have some challenges. Dogs who have maybe like, have to stay in the shelter due to behavior concerns, but have to go through kind of like what we talked about with the TPLO surgery, like a heartworm treatment, right? So social media, how are we talking about adding social media into things and when we can ask the community for help on a specific animal and what that can lead to. What about transferring dogs with behavior challenges to other shelters? So the other thing I wanted to talk about was adoptions and talking through behavior challenges with dogs and adopt with talking through behavior challenges about dogs with behaviors to potential adopters and how, like what type of transparency, what information do they need to know, when that can be successful, and then making clear decisions about an adoption process for a dog who has some behavior challenges. And then the open adoptions versus matchmaking. That is something that brings up a lot of ethical challenges, both with like our adoption staff and whether they feel it's a good fit or if they're passing personal judgment onto a person. So that's a huge one that I think comes up pretty frequently, is especially at shelters who have multiple people doing adoptions, where it's like, I wouldn't have given that dog to that person, so we see some things come up in that way. And I think that's another challenge that shelters deal with. Um, yes, Alicia, open adoptions versus matchmaking. I think there's a really cool middle ground that I have seen work pretty well. We obviously can't, get rid of all returns. That's just a normal part of sheltering in life. But yeah, I guess it's going to be a three-part series. So I really hope you guys join me for the next two. I did not realize that I was going to get so sunk into just one, but I think it's really challenging to think about some of these ethical things come up. These are just a few examples I've thought off the top of my head. I probably have 100. I'm pretty sure you guys do too. And, I think that the more that we understand and learn from each other's experiences, the more we can come together as a sheltering community to help each other and also create some of these guidelines and build that strength in our teams to ensure that we're transparent, that we're looking at all options, that we're weighing quality of life, we're looking at pluses and minuses, and we have to accept when things don't go like you don't get the choice. Your preferred choice is not the one that is chosen by consensus, and how to deal with those emotions that come with it. And then when you get the I told you so moments, being like, well, I can't sit here in that anger. I can only be proactive about things we can do in the future, and really taking away that piece of it, that if we start going into that solo mindset, it's not actually helpful for anybody, even if you feel it on the inside. It's more about coming up with solutions for the future, because that's how we build resiliency, for us, is making sure that we are continuing to work in that teamwork framework, because nobody can do this alone. So I guess that's my takeaway message. All right, so I guess I'll get on Brittany to post another two. This upcoming Monday, I'm actually interviewing my old boss that I used to work with as a behavior responder with the ASPCA. She was my team manager, and she managed our entire behavior team, which consisted of probably like 30 or so of us as we were rotating in and out of the temporary shelter. And she's phenomenal. And her specialty was managing us as the people. And then her co-manager, Bridget, was more focused on, the animal care side. But Christina is, how do I get a bunch of dog trainers to all get along together in a really intense temporary shelter where there's a lot of emotion. So Christina's going to be a really awesome guest. She's also doing some consulting now, and she's great. So I hope you guys join on Monday. It's $5, and I wouldn't miss it. if I was a behavior manager, I would definitely want to hear from Christina because it was amazing working for her, and she's probably the best people manager I've ever worked for. So please feel free to join us. And I hope you guys have a good rest of your week and do well, be well, and I'll see you soon.